Alright, so this is going to be the last part to this series. We've covered everything from the modeling of the terrain to applying the textures, setting up some basic render settings, and going through and sculpting the ground around the house. So there's one more thing that I just want to quickly go over, and that is the trees and how to duplicate them in order to help save on system resources. Now I know you're probably thinking, well, wait a minute, I know how to duplicate trees. You just click on one and you can do copy and paste, or just control click and drag to duplicate it. And yes, that's true. You can do that. But V-Ray comes with its own type of instancing system. Now you know for Cinema 4D, if you have an object and you don't actually want to duplicate that object to where you have all those extra polygons in the scene, you can just use an instance. And that will help save on your system resources, like the RAM. However, instead of calling it instancing, what V-Ray has is a proxy system. So in the case of these trees, if we were using the standard Cinema 4D engine to render this, we could just click on a tree and then go up here to the instance here, and that would create the instance for us. And then we could just duplicate that instance all around the scene. Or we could just use a MoGraph cloner object and activate the instance in the cloner object just to scatter the trees around. Now we could do that here with these objects here that we're using for V-Ray, but we already know how to do that, so I want to show you how to use the V-Ray proxy system. So what we want to do is let's clone the pine tree. If we jump into the camera, you can see that there's a couple of areas over here in this part that feel kind of empty. And I would rather put something in here just to kind of hide part of that landscape object that's back there. So we want to go find the pine tree, so there it is there. So with the pine tree selected, which is the main null object, we want to right click and go to the V-Ray bridge tags, and we want to use the VR mesh exporter. Alright, so once that tag is there, we need to go up here to plugins, V-Ray bridge, and we want the V-Ray proxy generator. Alright, so we'll click on the V-Ray proxy generator, and now it's asking us for the mesh exporter tag. So we need to click this tag here and drag it into that link box there. And now instantly a brand new tree, which is a proxy object, has been generated for us. So now I'll just take and move this back here out of the way. And I'll tell you what, let's go back to the camera. And I'm just going to push this tree around until it's into a position here that I think looks good. Maybe something right about there. So then all we need to do is take the V-Ray proxy generator object and just duplicate it. So I'm going to drag it down here next to the tree that is being generated from. And I'm just going to control click and drag to duplicate the proxy object. And with that one, then we'll just take it and I'm just going to move it maybe back a little ways, maybe about right there. And we'll make another one. And then I'm just going to drag this one off to where just part of it is kind of sticking out there. Not the entire tree is being seen, just a little bit of it. All right, now if we wanted to, we could do one more. And we'll take this one and we'll put it back over there. Okay, now you got to be careful with this because each one of these generated pine trees with the proxy object, it's all oriented the same way as the original one. So if we go take a look at the original tree, you'll notice up at the top of this tree here that we've got these pine needles that are sticking up and then one shooting off here to the right. And notice that this one here is oriented the same way. These here are kind of jetting off to the right as well. And same for that one and all of these here. So we can quickly fix this just by randomly rotating these proxy objects. So we'll select the first one and we'll just go to the coordinates tab here and I'm just going to rotate that around, something like that. We'll go to the second one, which is back there. Rotate that one a little ways, go to the second one, or I'm sorry, the third one, which is actually number 2. And that one we really can't see it all that well, but that's okay. And then of course the fourth one, which is actually number 3. And we'll rotate that one like that. And that way it just kind of adds some random rotation to these trees. That way if somebody's actually looking at these trees, they're not going to see that each one looks identical because they're all going to be oriented the same way. So we just want to break that up a little bit just by adding some random rotation values to each one of those proxy objects. All right, now if you wanted to, you could also do the large tree, which is going to be that one there. You could give the tall tree object a vray exporter tag like this one, and then what you would do is just make a new proxy file or vray proxy generator here, and then just drag that tag from the tall tree into there. But I'm not going to do that right now. I think that one of these tall trees is just fine, but maybe you want to add a little bit more, or maybe take one of these smaller ones here and just kind of move it around. Now there's one thing that we could probably do, and that's going to be, we'll take this green bush here and we're going to do one with that. Because I'd like to have one of these as leaning over, and I'd kind of like to stick it over here somewhere out of the way, maybe in front of the wall here, just to add some more greenery up here towards the front. So we'll give it a exporter tag. We'll take and create a new proxy generator. Drag the exporter tag into there. And there's the tree. Now we need to position this where we want it, and I'm just going to stick it there by the wall. So right now I think we'll just leave it leaning that way. I think that'll be just fine. So let's line it up here. Let's go to the top view, and I'm going to take it and just kind of put it right about there. And why not? Let's make another one, but this one here needs to be rotated a little bit. Maybe it's leaning outward and maybe back in just a little bit. And we'll put that one right there. Now we could also do something with these little plants and these little shrubs in here. However, for this, these little plants and shrubs are not really all that big. Now, more than likely, I would not use a proxy object for these. I would just take and duplicate them and then just position them down this little area here that's in front of the deck. All right, so there's a couple things that I see that I missed. And that would be, I need to apply a wood texture to the deck. And I'm just going to take these trees here, these little bushes, and I'm going to take them and I'm just going to scatter them around in this area here. So I'm going to go ahead and do that real quick, and then when we come back, we'll talk about the final render settings. Okay, so I finished up the textures there, put the wood texture on the decking there, and I just used a texture that I just found and placed in the texture folder. So if you go into the texture folder, that's one that I just now added to it called Wood 05. So we'll just use that one for the wood decking. And I know it's probably going to have some repeatable patterns in it, but that's okay because most of the wood decking is covered in snow, so you're really not going to pick it up anyway. So that texture will be just fine. All right, I also went ahead and duplicated the bushes here along the front, and while I was at it, I decided to just go ahead and use some proxy objects. Here you can see those there generated for the bush. There's the proxy objects there. Okay, so there's one more thing, and this is something that I should have done towards the beginning of this series, and that is down here in the bottom right-hand corner, you can see that it's cut off. Now, there's a couple of ways around this. We can take and extend this just a little bit, or we could move the camera in. So let's try taking the camera, and I'm just going to move it in just enough just to get that to cover up down at the bottom like that. And I just want to center the house here. All right, so that looks pretty good. Now I'm going to turn the displacer on because I've made some changes in the displacer. Some of you might be following along with that. Maybe you just kind of built your own landscaping, but I had the displacer and used that on the plane. And let me jump out of the camera so we can see this a little better. When it's on, it really slows things down, so I'm just going to turn it off for a moment. Alright, so everything you see here on the ground, I did all this with the brush tool. You can see some areas are more highly subdivided than others, but overall this is a very highly subdivided plane object, and I just used the brush tool just to kind of sculpt some car tracks and some footprints and just some little mounds and hills in there. Now notice that these other areas are rather flat, so I use the displacer object, and if I turn that on, you can see what that does. It just adds more detail to the ground, which looks really nice. Now I originally had some noise in here with some low scaling. So if we go into the shading and I have noise, the noise type is turbulence. And now I originally had this set to a global scale of 100%. And then I just kind of played around with it and then decided that it actually looks better if I take it up. So I'm using a value of 500% for the displacer. Okay, now one thing that we need to be careful with is this is using the displacer, but notice the ground back behind it is not using a displacer. So what we may have to do here is find those landscaping objects, this one here and this one here. So that's going to be that one and that one, and we may need to add a displacer object to those. So I'm just going to duplicate the displacer to those. So let's get in here and let's see if this is going to work with a primitive. So let's turn that one on for that one, and you can see that it is working. Okay, that's fine. Now we really can't see it all that well, and the reason for that is because the landscape object is not subdivided as much as this ground plane here is. However, I don't think it's going to make an issue. The only thing that I see that might be an issue is this line here between the ground plane and the landscape object. So let's make, see there's a line going across there. So what we could do is we could take that landscape object and just pull it down. And then we'll turn the displacer back on. Okay, we're getting a little bit showing right there. So let's go back to the landscape and just pull that down. All right, now I want to render a little region across there. I just want to be sure that we're not going to get some weird line that's going to be showing up between the ground plane here that we're using for the house and the landscape object. All right, so as you can see, I think that's going to work out really well. So let's go see if there's going to be any issues with this other one over here. So we'll turn that on. And yep, there's going to be a little issue there. So we'll go to that landscape object and we'll just take its Y value down as well. And that should alleviate any problems on that one. All right, so for the time being, I'm just going to turn the displacer off for both of these landscape objects there. Okay, so let's talk about the render settings. So we'll go into the render settings over to the V-Ray bridge, and the settings for this are pretty much going to be the same as they were when I did the first V-Ray series months ago on the interior beach house. Now the only difference is that we're using an area dome light with an HDR in order to light the exterior of the house. And in the other series, we were just using a regular infinite light with area shadows, and that was giving us our physical sky because the V-Ray tag comes with a physical sky option. Now, when you're dealing with exterior shots, the general rule of thumb is that you want to use an irradiance map and brute force for the outside. Now, I know some people that they like to use a light cache and an irradiance map for the outside, and they can get pretty good results with that. However, from what I have been told, what I have read, and just in my own experimenting with V-Ray, I prefer the results of using brute force. Sometimes I get some very odd and strange light artifacts when I'm rendering exterior shots using V-Ray if I use the light cache and the irradiance map. Sometimes there are areas that it just doesn't look right for some reason. I don't know what it is. So using brute force will solve that issue of those light artifacts. Now over on the V-Ray forums, there's a very basic tutorial there on how to set up a lot of these settings for exterior shots, and the user there explains that he likes to use irradiance map and brute force as well for exterior, and irradiance map and light cache for interior. So we're going to be using the brute force and irradiance map method for this shot. So we'll go over to the GI tab, and you can see we're already using the irradiance map and the brute force. We just need to turn it up. So what I'm going to do is I'm just going to pick one of these high quality ones. So I'm going to use the number 13 here, which is the irradiance map brute force high outdoor. You can see that there is a lot of presets here that are provided. So if you want in your own time, feel free to experiment with a lot of these. Maybe you'll like some of the results better than others. But for this, we're going to use number 13. Okay, so let's go over to the color mapping. And I already have it set to exponential, which is pretty much what I'm going to use for this. But you're welcome to experiment with some of these other types. Now, there's only a couple of them that I like to use. And I like to use exponential. And I also like to use Reinhard. Now with Reinhard, you may need to take the burn value down because Reinhard has a tendency to have some of the areas where you have a bright light, and the burn value will actually take that and kind of give you a lot of hot, bright, contrasted areas. So you may need to turn the burn value down. However, in the case of what we're doing here, I just happen to like the way exponential looks. All right, now linear workflow. Now that's a whole other subject in itself, is linear workflow. I'm not going to be using linear workflow for this. You're welcome to turn it on if you want to. There's a lot of different variations that you can get if you turn on linear workflow. Be sure that you set your gamma to, I believe if you're on Windows, I believe it's 2.2. If you're on a Mac, I believe it's 1.8, I believe. However, a lot of guys that use V-Ray, they have a tendency to not go with that and just use different values. Sometimes it may be too blown out or too dark. So you have to experiment around with the gamma setting. I know some V-Ray users, they use linear workflow all the time and they keep their gamma value set to 1. So again, that's a whole other subject. Maybe at a later time we'll get into that. But for now, I'm just going to keep all of that turned off, and I'm going to keep all these values at 1. Okay, anti-aliasing. We're going to leave it set to adaptive. And for the low-res rendering that we were doing, it was 1:2. Now, I know some guys that like to take the max and turn it up to 100. And that's, that's great. But for something like this, I think maybe a value of 12. So we'll just leave it at 12. You may want to experiment around with this. 12 might be too much for you, or you may need more. So feel free to experiment. All right, so I think that pretty much wraps all of this up. The environment, we really don't need to mess around with any of the environment. We don't need any caustics, don't need any of this. V-Ray system, we don't need to do anything with that. Everything else here looks pretty good. We're not doing any type of animation, so there's no need to have to cache anything. So we're just going to go ahead and render this. So I'm going to do an output, and I'm just going to do a 1280 by 720. I think that'll be just fine. And I'm not worrying about saving it at the moment. So I'm going to go ahead and render that out. I actually had something going there from earlier. All right, so I'm going to go ahead and pause this and let this render, and we'll come back and we'll see what it looks like. Okay, so now the render is finished, and it took 1 hour and 28 seconds on my machine, which really isn't all that bad considering that my machine is roughly 4 or 5 years old. And the only thing I see on here that I would probably want to change, the first thing that pops out would be we've got a little bit of the lower part of the horizon that's showing up here. And the reason for that is because remember we moved the camera to kind of help fill in the gap that was down here at the right hand corner on the bottom. So when we moved the camera, we exposed part of that horizon line back there beneath the HDR image. So more than likely what we could do to fix that is just take the landscape object and just move it over to fill that in. Or you could just add another tree back there somewhere. So that's not really a big issue. That's very easily fixed. The next thing that I see would probably be the snow shader itself. It could probably use a little more refining. You can see that we are getting some nice areas in here where the specular is showing up on it really nice, but there are other areas where it looks kind of wet. Now, if you're going for a really wet snow, then of course this would work just fine. But if you're going for more of a dry, powdery type of snow, then you may want to play around with the specular and kind of tone that down a little bit, just so you don't get these areas where it looks like the snow has been kind of iced over. Kind of like, I don't know if any of you have actually seen the type of snow, but once the snow lays and then it's wet and you get like a very, very thin layer of ice over the top of the snow. All right, so everything else looks pretty good. I'm just kind of looking around just to see what else could be changed. Perhaps maybe we could add some tracks or some trees or little bushes or something back here just to kind of fill in that empty area there behind the house. We could also do something back here. Perhaps maybe add some tracks, or maybe on this tall landscape object here we could put some type of rock or ground material on it and then use the fall off shader on the snow to kind of make it look like the snow is on top, but you can also see the underlying rocks or perhaps maybe gravel or sand or something like that. So that's another thing that we could do there. But for the most part, the house, the trees, the snow, all of the areas around here, everything looks pretty good. I'm happy with it. So I think I'm going to go ahead and wrap up this series on V-Ray exteriors. I hope that you've enjoyed watching this series. I know it's been a little long and some of this stuff has been kind of repetitious, but when you're doing this kind of work, that's the kind of thing you got to have patience for. So I hope you guys have learned some new things here using V-Ray for exteriors. And as always, thank you for watching, and I'll catch you guys in the next tutorial.